Hello and welcome to Cairns Catches Up. Tom Cairns, your host, where I speak to people within the motorsport world about their careers, the challenges they've faced along the way, and perhaps maybe the advice they can share on those wanting to work within motorsport. Today's guest is someone who has worked within the journalism world within motorsport, particularly within Formula One, who's worked as a commentator and as a historian. It's Mr. Simon Taylor. Good afternoon, sir.
Hello, good afternoon.
How are you? Because it's a long time since we've seen you within the world of Formula One, but how has life been treating you since those days?
It's been treating me very well. I don't really believe in the word retirement because if you're lucky enough to have a job that you love, the worst thing you can possibly do is stop doing it because then you get old and sit in front of afternoon television and do nothing very much. So I'm still very much involved in motorsport. I still write. I don't like writing about modern Formula One because I feel I've moved on, it has moved on, and our paths have parted. I obviously worked in Formula One as a journalist or a commentator for 30 or more years. But Formula One is very different now. Um, However, I'm still involved in club motorsport. I'm a hill climber. I have a car that I compete with still. And going right back to my beginnings in journalism, I've always felt very strongly that motorsport is a very broad canvas. Today, when Formula One is so well promoted, is so well covered on television, now that it covers every type of medium, people don't realise, an awful lot of people who are aware of Formula One, perhaps enjoy watching it on television, they don't really understand that motorsport does not only consist of Formula One. They may feel that they're big motor racing enthusiasts, but they only really ever watch Formula One on television. They don't actually go to events. Formula One is, if you like, the tip of a very wide iceberg. It's the most important part of motorsport, but it's actually, in terms of numbers of events, a very tiny part of motorsport. And motorsport is going on in so many different ways. I mean, there are very humble ways that you can take part in motorsport and have an enormous amount of fun and frighten yourself with a very small expenditure. Um, Too many people think that motor racing is for millionaires, it's for celebrities. They don't feel that they could ever take part in motorsport. You can take part in motorsport if you go and buy a £1,000 hatchback and turn up and do sprinting, hill climbing, auto tests, all sorts of things. And you don't only need to come up through teenage karting and be have well-heeled parents to get you into motorsport at a serious level when you're 16, 17, 18. If you want to, if your ambitions are Formula One, you may have to do that. But you can actually earn a living in motorsport coming from very humble beginnings. That's a pretty long answer to your question, what have I been doing in the last few years? And I still write. I still do the odd bit of commentating, the odd bit of public speaking, really just because I love motorsport. I've worked in it all my life. And it's a habit that you can't shrug, and it's a habit that you shouldn't shrug if you've been lucky enough, as I have, to do a job that you've loved doing. And I've always felt I would have been a motorsports journalist even if nobody paid me, because it's what I love to do.
Mhm. And you've mentioned about how long you've been working within the motorsport community. You've worked as a journalist, as a commentator, a publisher, and a historian. You joined the weekly magazine Autosport straight from university, of which you became editor at the age of 23, which is kind of the big step in your journalism career within motorsport, wasn't it?
It was, but I always feel I can't take any credit for that, because so much of life is luck. So much of it is down to being in the right place at the right time. I joined Autosport as the most junior possible editorial assistant. I'd been doing a little bit of freelancing for them, writing odd bits and pieces while I was still at university. So I knew the place and I knew the people, and good piece of luck, number one, was that just as I was about to leave university and go and do a rather boring job, a vacancy appeared on Autosport. So I was able to get a job straight from university. About 18 months later, the magazine changed hands. It was bought up by a man called Michael Heseltine, who went on to try and only just failed to be Prime Minister. But he was building up a publishing concern and was buying up lots of small magazines. And he bought Autosport, his company bought Autosport. And the rest of the staff didn't really like having a different boss with a different setup. And they all left. So, I mean, it was a tiny operation anyway. It had an editorial staff of 3.5 people. But those 3.5 people left, and I found overnight that I went from the lowest of the low, the most junior editorial assistant, to being editor. I was totally thrown in at the deep end. And that's a very good way to progress. If somebody throws you in the deep end, you have to swim. But although it sounds very exciting that I became the editor at the age of 23, I was just lucky. I was in the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm. It's a competitive world out there to get any job within journalism. You know, you get like thousands and thousands of applications being sent through to employers about, you know, even it's just being an assistant editor or even just being a junior writer for the team. I do perfectly agree that it requires a lot of luck. I'm an example of that, you know, within journalism. I mean, it's great to get some experience under yourself, even if you're not earning a penny from doing it. It's nice to get those opportunities. But when you go and get paid work within the more established companies, like Autosport, for instance, or the race media, as they are now, it's very, very, very hard. I've had that from my experience since I left university in 2018. You moved on to a publisher called Haymarket Magazines, as well as launching other car magazines, What Car and Classic and Sports Cars, before becoming Haymarket's managing director and then the chairman of it. Quite a
Yes,
rise.
yeah, I mentioned earlier that the reason why I suddenly became editor at 23 was because the magazine had changed hands. And that was Haymarket. Michael Heseltine had started this company called Haymarket. Autosport, to be frank, wasn't making any money at that point. It was actually losing money. And Michael's idea was to find small, struggling magazines that were scattered around all over the landscape and to put them all in one building, put them in one company, and try to organize them and run them in a more professional way and make them make money. So that's what happened to Autosport. I found myself being taken over by Haymarket, and having been the editor for 4 or 5 years, there were other opportunities within the company. So I moved from being a motor racing journalist, which is obviously what I love, to being a publisher, being much more of a businessman, which, although part of what I was doing was launching new car magazines. I launched What Car, I launched Classic and Sports Car, and gradually grew the motoring side of the company. Nevertheless, I still wanted, as it were, to get my hands dirty from the journalism end, rather than just driving a desk and trying to make a profit and trying to be a businessman. And the way I solved that was by going to motor races at weekends and persuading the organisers of these motor races to let me do public commentaries, trackside commentaries, which was tremendous fun. It was very hard work. It wasn't really paid anything at all, but it was the most fantastic experience to teach you how to describe what is going on in front of your eyes. The thing you have to remember is that if you're a motor racing commentator, what underpins your ability to describe what you're seeing and to allow people either at the racetrack who need to be told what's going on, even though they can see bits of the race themselves, or if you're talking to on the radio to people listening at home, or if you're commentating for television so that there is a picture that you are explaining the picture to the people who are watching. Underpinning all of that is what we used to call homework. It doesn't matter how good a talker you are, how good a describer you are. What you actually need to do is solid, hard work before the program or the race meeting even begins. If you're a Formula One commentator, this is going to be an oversimplification, but if you're a Formula One commentator, then you need to know absolutely everything about 24 drivers and 12 racing teams. If you're a commentator at a club meeting at Brands Hatch, where they may have 12 races during the day, each with 20 different competitors, you probably have to know something about 240 drivers. Because even though you won't be talking about each of those 240, you don't know before your radio program starts, before your television coverage starts, who is going to be on camera. You have to know about all 240 people, even though you may only talk about 24 of them. Now, that is a bit of special pleading because obviously, if you are covering Formula One, and I've done both radio and TV Formula One a long time ago now, but I've worked with the great Murray Walker, I've worked with James Hunt. I worked for probably 20 years as BBC Radio's commentator. And of course, doing Formula One, it's a gross oversimplification to say it's just 12 teams and 24 drivers or whatever. In fact, the amount of knowledge that you need to do a good Formula One coverage is huge. And just a word about Murray Walker. Murray became a national icon. Everybody loved Murray, although at the beginning of Murray's Formula One television career, people sneered at him because they thought he had a funny voice. People laughed at his occasional mistakes. If you're talking several million words across a career or even in a year, and you get 0.1% of them wrong, that 0.1% is what remains with people. And Murray always had this millstone around his neck that there were Murrayisms, there were mistakes that he made. He was always very good humoured about that. But I can tell you that we used to arrive at a circuit, probably Thursday morning, and maybe we'd go to our hotels to unload our bags and just sort of, get settled in. Murray would go straight from the airport to the track, and he would walk a lap of the track before he did anything. And he would make notes of exactly where each camera position was, what advertising hoardings would go in each picture so that he could do all the identification. He didn't walk a lap of the Nürburgring when the German Grand Prix was there, because that's 14 miles. He would go around in his hire car. But the point I'm making is that Murray, and I worked with him and I loved him as a friend, I knew, and he was the greatest example of this, that there is no substitute for hard research work before the race even begins. And it's the same being a journalist. You can be a wonderful writer, but if your writing isn't underpinned by a real knowledge of what's going on, then you won't earn the respect of the reader. And by that I mean not only knowledge that you have researched and found out, but actually knowledge that you've gained from other people. You can read a magazine article and it's all about what you know and about what you think. Or you can read a magazine article which talks to a driver, which talks to a team owner, which talks to a couple of mechanics and gets their view. And all of that is part of the work that you should be doing, which comes under this umbrella of research. I can't stress too strongly the need to have the right knowledge. And so often we've read pieces, too often perhaps in daily newspapers, or I've heard circuit commentators displaying ignorance, but that ignorance is because they haven't done their homework, haven't done the work first. And the old cliche says there is no substitute for hard work. What's the other cliche? That it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. No substitute for hard work.
I would perfectly agree with that. And because hard work requires very much hard work, it's about knowing every aspect of the job that you're there to do, knowing who is going to be racing, where the circuit is, walking around the lap of the circuits where Murray Walker did, apart from the Nordschleife for the 14-mile long. I mean, that would have taken him quite some time for him to note everything down, because there'd have been more for him to note down than any of the other circuits that he would have done. I was a huge fan of Murray. I mean, especially during the video games. I mean, I wasn't born until 1995, Simon, so I perhaps had quite a bit to learn about Murray before a number of other people. But he was such a talented man and so fun loved. Everyone appreciated his enthusiasm. And what I really was really adored by was whenever he made a mistake, people forgave him for it. Whereas if it was someone else, they may not have forgiven that person as much. Would you agree with that?
I would. There is an absolutely major ingredient. I mean, forget what I just said about 99% hard work, because here is another ingredient which on its own should be 99%. The reason why Murray Walker was so good as a commentator and as a man working in the media was because he loved motor racing. He adored what he was doing. And when he spoke with passion, and we can all remember some of Murray's most passionate moments, like, for example, and I was there doing it for radio when Damon Hill clinched the World Championship, and Murray said, "I've got to stop," as he took the flag, Murray said, "I've got to stop talking now because I've got a lump in my throat." Now, actually, Murray didn't stop talking because you couldn't stop Murray talking, but it was the most wonderful thing to say. And he said it because he meant it. Murray spoke with passion because he loved motor racing. And here's the point. However hard you try, however clever an actor you are, if you haven't got that passion, you can't pretend. You can't pretend to be excited when you're commentating. You've really got to be excited. And if you've become cynical, if motor racing no longer excites you, then you must stop. Because however clever you are at pretending, the viewer, the listener, the reader, they will all know. And Murray was great because he was passionate. I was still talking to him right up until he died in his late 90s. And I'd ring him up, and he was quite frail by the end. But I'd phone him up, and the voice would be absolutely the same at the other end of the phone. "Hello, Simon!" And he would be watching every Grand Prix, every qualifying session. He still loved it. And so what you need, I mean, we're going through the ingredients. You need luck. You've mentioned luck. You need hard work. You need to be prepared to put in the hours and the days and the weeks and the months of actually finding out, doing your research, and then you need the passion. You need to love it. And this is not, of course, peculiar to motor racing. I mean, if you want to be a success at anything, you've got to care about it. And obviously, the great commentators on any sport, the great news hounds, if you watch particularly moving television news report from a war zone, and we've seen far too many of those recently, and a lot of them are incredibly well done. It's because the person who's making the broadcast cares, and you can't pretend about anything like that. It's got to matter to you. So we've got 3 ingredients so far: luck, hard work, and passion.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your time within BBC Radio. You were the voice for more than 20 years, reporting on Formula One and all over the world, and along with your TV commentary and presenting work, and being part of ITV's F1 team when they took over the UK broadcast rights in 1997. During your time within BBC Radio first, how was that for you?
I absolutely loved radio. You have to remember that I'm of a generation. I was born at the end of World War II, and although television had certainly been invented, television was not a central part of our lives. And I think my parents didn't get their first television set until I was about 14. But radio was a huge part of my life. I mean, from before I could speak, there was radio going on in the house. And one listened to the news as part of the kind of daily routine. Radio was an enormous force for people of my age. Throughout the 50s, there were great radio sports commentators, and they became household names, just as Murray Walker later became household names. And I loved listening to live radio broadcasts and hearing how the great radio commentators described what they were seeing. If you're a television commentator, this is another, I'm afraid, of my oversimplifications, but if you're a television commentator, the picture is the king. The picture is what matters. And as a television commentator, you are explaining to the audience what is going on in the picture. They can see the picture, but your knowledge and your understanding will expand what they're seeing and will explain it. But you have to talk to the picture. You are, if you like, writing a caption to a picture. If you're talking on radio, it's just you. All the listener has, and he may be the other side of the world. I remember doing the Japanese Grand Prix in 1976, which was the famous and dramatic conclusion of an extraordinary season of a fight between James Hunt and Niki Lauda. And amazingly, because this was back in 1976 and things were different, the race happened because of the time difference at 6 o'clock in the morning, and there was no live television coverage. Edited highlights went out on the Sunday afternoon, but live, the only way that if you were part of the English-speaking world, the only way you could get live coverage of what was going on was by listening to BBC Radio, and it was also going out on the BBC World Service. So I don't know what the audience was, but it was millions across the world. And all they had was my little voice coming out of the loudspeaker. So I had to not only have the facts, I had to paint the picture, I had to give the impression of what was really going on. And that's what's magical about radio. If you have a good radio commentator, he not only tells you what's going on, but he paints the picture, because you're all he's got. Television, you may have a team of 80 people or more looking after the output. When I did radio, I was on my own. I remember being in Japan. I had a pair of pliers and a few lengths of wire, and a Japanese technician who was given back to me by the local broadcaster to try and help to make things work. And I didn't speak Japanese and he didn't speak English, and it was pouring with rain. And so it was kind of primitive. But I loved being the only link between what I was seeing and all those millions of people out there. And that's what's special about radio. You need a different skill to be a good radio commentator from being a good television commentator. They're both extremely difficult. I wouldn't say which is easier or which is not. And obviously, radio is much less important now because most people have access to a screen, even if it's only their phone or their laptop. So television coverage, I don't know what the figures are, but I mean, television coverage is now immense, or television audience is now immense for Formula One. But radio still, if you're sitting in the car and you're driving down the M1 and you can't get to the pictures, listen to the radio and see if the radio commentator, if he's good, is really giving you the entire picture.
It's an incredible time and an incredible thing to know about the events of 1976, the Japanese Grand Prix, the intense championship decider between James Hunt and Niki Lauda. We obviously know what happened in that one, where Niki Lauda simply withdrew at the end of lap 1 because the conditions were too dangerous. He had that accident at the Nordschleife earlier in the year. James Hunt was brave enough to keep going despite a slow puncture, which he had in the closing stages, which meant he had to gain positions to get up into that lucrative third place to snatch the championship by 1 point, which links to the film Rush, Simon, which you played a part in. How was that for you compared to how you got on when you were over in Japan for BBC Radio at the time?
Well, the first thing to say is I played a very small part. Blinker, you miss me. But being involved in that film was fascinating. The first thing I would say, though, just going back to your description of what happened at Mount Fuji in 1976, Niki Lauda did not withdraw because as a kind of indirect result of the accident he'd had in August. What he actually did in withdrawing was it was just typical Niki Lauda, who was a phenomenally brave man. I mean, one of the bravest men I've ever known, and not only in his motor racing, but in all sorts of other bits of his life, which we don't need to go into here. He took a rational decision to withdraw from that race because he thought it was wrong for the race to take place. And of course, he went on to win the World Championship the following year. And James continued not because James was braver than Niki. They were very different human beings. And James would certainly not have given up he wouldn't have taken the decision that Niki took. We could talk a lot about that one single race. As for the film, firstly, it was a great privilege and a fascinating experience to be kind of on the edge of, because I certainly wasn't centrally involved, to be on the edge of a big Hollywood movie, because it's an incredible operation. I mean, I'm quoting the figures from memory. I think it cost $240 million to make that film, but it made, the gross take in cinemas was $900 million. That's the sort of size of figures you're working with. And that was, 20 years ago or so. But what was really impressive about it, I mean, there have been other efforts by Hollywood to make motor racing movies. Of course they have. They go back to the 50s and before. Some of them have been dreadful. Some of them have been quite good. I'm biased, but I think Rush was probably one of the best. And one of the reasons why it was so good was because Ron Howard, who was the director, well known as a child actor originally in Hollywood, but he became one of Hollywood's best directors with a tremendous um, roster of great movies from um, Apollo 13 to Parenthood. He'd done lots of movies and he really minded about getting the detail right. I did a bit of, I did a bit, you can't call it acting, but I mean, I was in the film playing the British commentator, so I suppose I was playing myself and it was wonderful to do. But Ron Howard also asked me to come into, to be involved in the editing of the film. If you know anything about movies, you end up with, I don't know, 84 hours of film, and you've got to edit it down to a couple of hours. And it's the editing that really decides whether a film is good or not. Ron Howard is a passionately detailed editor. In television, you never have time to do anything. If you're doing a recording program, you can't spend very long on it. It's got to be done by 3 o'clock this afternoon. It's a tight budget. In movies, it's different. You've got a lot of time. You've got a huge budget. And Ron might worry for an hour about 2 or 3 frames of film. And the reason why he wanted to involve me was he made no secret of the fact that he wasn't a motor racing expert. He loved the thought of this film about 2 people, Niki Lauda and James Hunt. But he wanted to make sure that the motor racing enthusiasts in the audience wouldn't groan when they saw something which wasn't true to life. And so I was able to offer, in my humble way, some advice about how, for example, a pit stop should be shown. There are some ways in which films have to take liberties. For example, you'd see in Rush that when James Hunt comes in and makes a pit stop, which would perhaps have lasted when they had that rather disastrous tire change, perhaps it lasted 20 seconds, 25 seconds, and yet you see Hunt and one of the pit crew actually having a conversation, which of course doesn't happen in real life. But it was done in such a way that it told the story, and I think it was acceptable. My own view about some of the other films, I mean, the film about Ford and Ferrari at Le Mans, which did quite well in the cinemas, and it told a good story. But I thought it was dreadful because the liberties it took with what really happened and what Ken Miles and Carroll Shelby were really like was, I think, disgraceful. And the way that it showed the Le Mans 24 hours, implying, as far as I could see, that only one driver drove in Le Mans, because you never heard anything about the co-driver. You were left with the feeling that Carroll Shelby was America's greatest racing driver. Carroll Shelby never designed a racing car in his life. He was a great driver. He was a wonderful hustler. He was a tremendous entrepreneur and deal maker. And he was responsible, obviously, for the Cobra. And his drive had a lot to do with the Ford GT40, which, of course, didn't have its roots in the United States. It had its roots in England and Lola. So we've gone perhaps off your subject, but I think that a motor racing film has to worry about accuracy for the knowledgeable people like you and me, rather than just making it a good show for the audience who will never see a motor race and who don't really know what the Le Mans 24 hours is.
Going on some more about you, Simon. The season reviews, the official Formula One season reviews, which you were involved in the 80s and the 90s, which kind of brought me, because I've got the VHS of the 1996 season review, with which you were involved in, which made me think, who is that guy's voice? Because it's quite a really subtle, energetic individual. And I was wanting to know who that was. And thankfully, I found out it was you. And
Well,
how was
I don't
that?
think it's subtle. I don't think it's. I mean, I'm very flattered to be told that I'm subtle. I don't think anybody's accused me of that before. But yes, what I used to do, as well as doing obviously my radio work at Grand Prix, and I have to say, to admit that I was actually doing my proper job for Haymarket, basically Monday to Friday. So I was quite a busy boy. But Bernie Eccleston had an offshoot. This was originally when he first owned Brabham. So he made a little studio in the basement of the Brabham factory, because Bernie also was getting to the point where he was, on behalf of FOCA, he was taking over the television rights. And he therefore said that if there was going to be any television coverage retrospectively, then that was something that he had to do, because he effectively owned the copyright. So I actually used to voice a commentary on an edit of every Grand Prix. I never quite learned what Bernie did with it. I think he probably sold it to countries that weren't taking any live coverage. So probably if you'd been in Iceland and you wanted to hear a summary of the Grand Prix that had happened the previous weekend, you would probably hear me, except I'm sure the Iceland broadcasters would have dubbed over an Icelandic commentary anyway. But I used to do these for every single race. And they were probably edited down to about 40 minutes. So it did involve doing a pretty full commentary. And also, one of the very important things about doing work like that is it doesn't work if you kind of do it in the past tense. If you make it clear that you are sitting in a cellar underneath the Brabham factory on Thursday evening, talking about a race that happened the previous Sunday, there is no energy and excitement. So what you have to do is you pretend that you're there, which was always quite possible for me because I probably had been there the previous Sunday. So that would be a 40-minute edit, which we would do, to use the sort of broadcasting slang, we would do it as live, which means I would be commentating as though it was happening then. I had to be surprised when something happened, but of course I knew it was coming, that sort of thing. And then at the end of the season, there would be another edit, which would be, I mean, in those days, I think there were 16 rounds, 18 rounds of the World Championship. And so that would be edited down into, well, you would be able to tell me, I don't know how long that season edit that you've got would have been, but was it 2 hours or something?
For 1996, I think it was like 90 minutes.
Right, fine, okay. Well, that would be edited down, and I think I'm right in saying, I've never heard it, so one never sort of looked at the results of what one was doing. You'll be able to tell me whether I'm right or not, but I think that the season summary would be done in the past tense. You would say something like, and then the scene moved to Monza, where we had a quite extraordinary race because So it would be done in the past tense. I always feel, I think when you get to my great age, you always think that your day was the best day. I worked as a motorsport journalist covering races from 1966. I started, although I didn't get to Formula One races there. I used to do Formula Two races. And I carried on probably for 40 years, either writing or commentating. And of course, I think that those 40 years were the greatest years, the Ayrton Senna years, the Jochen Rindt and Jackie Stewart years, the Nigel Mansell years. It was a great time to be involved in Formula One. And what has really changed about Formula One Of course, the technology is superb. Formula One cars today are incredibly clever pieces of kit, and the people who produce them are geniuses. Compared to how things were in the 70s, 80s, 90s, of course the cars were much more primitive then. But the whole atmosphere within Formula One was much more of a kind of small parish, if you understand what I mean. It was friendly. There weren't the huge audiences around. There certainly weren't the huge sums of money. I mean, the idea of racing drivers being paid the sums of money that they are now being paid, up to £1 million a race, that would just seem to be science fiction. There weren't any private planes in the 70s. Or if there were, they would be little things with 1 or 2 propellers, which rather brave drivers might have used for fun. What actually happened is that if we were going to Japan, or if we were going to Brazil or Argentina, wherever the race was, we all travelled on the same planes. I mean, the mechanics may have gone on an earlier plane, and of course a lot of their kit was air freighted. But the drivers, the team bosses, the engineers, the journalists, the commentators, we all flew on the same plane. We all waited around in the same airport lounges. We all suffered the same delays in the middle of the night. We probably all stayed in the same hotels. We drank after the race in the same bars. So it was a small and very friendly unit. And if you were a driver, if you were a journalist or a commentator who had a reasonable amount of respect among the drivers or the team bosses or the mechanics, if they didn't think you were a complete idiot, they would be very friendly. And it was a friendly little operation. And if you wanted to go and talk to a driver about his thoughts about qualifying on Saturday evening, he would talk to you. He would probably know that if he said something and said, "That's between you and me," he could trust you that you wouldn't print it or wouldn't say it on radio or television the next day. So it was very different from the kind of huge circus that it is now, where you can't interview a driver without having a public relations person standing at his elbow and jogging his elbow if the PR person thinks the conversation is going in the wrong direction. It was a small and friendly setup, which was lovely for me because it meant that these drivers, who are now famous in history, were my friends. I didn't know Jim Clark particularly well because he was killed in 1968. I did know Bruce McLaren quite well. Jochen Rindt, who was killed at Monza in 1970, was a particular friend of mine because when I first became a journalist, I used to cover Formula 2. I wasn't allowed to cover Formula 1. The then editor of Autosport did that. But I was allowed to go to Formula 2. And Formula 2 then, seems extraordinary to believe now, Formula 2 was done by all the Formula 1 drivers. The Grand Prix were fortnightly, and in the weekend between the Grand Prix, they'd all go and do a Formula 2 race, which was brilliant because if you were a young, up-and-coming driver, you found yourself in your new Formula 2 car on the same circuit as Graham Hill, as Jackie Stewart, as Jean-Pierre Beltoise, as Jochen Rindt, which meant you could really show, what you were worth. And the Grand Prix drivers loved going to Formula 2 races because they were more relaxed than Grand Prix. They were kind of a bit of a weekend off. Jochen Rindt loved Formula 2. I covered all the Formula 2 races. We became mates, really. The other side of that, of course, Jackie Stewart will still say to you how many friends of his died during his motor racing career. And when you got friendly with these drivers, when one of them got killed, and it happened far too often in the late 60s and early 70s, it was a real blow. One driver who was killed in a Formula 2 race was actually my flatmate. And I got used, if there was a race that I hadn't been to, I got used to listening for the phone on Sunday night. No mobile phones then, of course, but if I was at home in my flat, the phone would ring and give me the news that somebody had been killed. And I then had to sit down and write an obituary. And writing obituaries of your friends and having to get them done by 6 o'clock next morning so that we can start putting it to press, that's quite tough. In 1970, just to take 1 year, Bruce McLaren was killed on a Tuesday morning at Goodwood, testing the latest McLaren Can-Am car. The rear bodywork came off, and Goodwood in those days was just a test track. There was nothing much around. But there was the remains of one old marshal's post, an earth bank. And if Bruce had gone off 2 feet one way or 2 feet the other, he would have been unhurt. But in fact, he hit that marshal's post head on. And that happened on a Tuesday morning. And Autosport used to go to press on Tuesday afternoon. And the magazine was all ready. In those days, it wasn't like now. You put the magazine to press at the printers, and the printers involved a huge machine the size of a supermarket with lead and paper going round. It's not like that anymore. But we would put the magazine to press, and it was all pretty much finished. The leader page was written, the news pages were locked up. We were all ready to go, and I got a phone call from Goodwood that said Bruce is dead. And I then had to stop the magazine going to press, rejig the front of the magazine. I had to write an obituary to Bruce in 40 minutes. Now, you think what a huge figure Bruce McLaren was. That was a difficult task. And in that year, Bruce was killed in May. In July, Piers Courage, another good friend of mine, wonderful driver, much better than the history books tell you, and a man with enormous potential, delightful man. He was killed at Zandvoort in the Dutch Grand Prix in July. And then in September, Jochen was killed at Monza. A Lotus failure, a front brake shaft broke. The Lotus 72 had inboard brakes, which were connected to the front wheels by shafts. Colin Chapman, always desperate to save weight, made those shafts hollow. After Jochen's accident, they were replaced with solid ones. And Jochen hated 5-point harness. He didn't like crutch straps. We used to tease him about it. There was a sort of various ribald jokes used to go on about it. But Jochen would never have crutch straps. And when the Lotus 72 turned sharp left because the right-hand brake shaft had broken, so that there was braking on the front left and not on the front right, and the car turned sharp left, hit the barriers, and he submarined down in the cockpit out of his harness because he didn't have crutch straps. That sort of thing happened so often. Roger Williamson being killed at Zandvoort at just the same point that Piers Courage had been killed. 2 years before. Same race, same corner. And still there weren't proper fire marshals. Roger was actually unhurt, I was told by people who were there. Well, David Purley, who was the man who tried to get him out, and he was fully conscious in the car, not really hurt, but he was trapped. And David told me he could never get out of his head the sounds that Roger made. Imagine he's virtually unhurt, he's fully conscious, the car is on fire. And if there'd been proper fire marshals, instead of people waving flags who were wearing T-shirts, then his life could have been saved. Well, fortunately, motor racing has moved on, and fatalities in motor racing are very, very rare. There's still a possibility because the speeds are huge, but the cars are so different, circuits are so different. And looking back, it's horrifying to remember how many times that happened. And we remember, the history books remember the Formula One drivers who died, maybe the people racing at Le Mans who died. But people got killed at Castle Combe and Alton Park in club events every weekend. It was outrageous how dangerous motor racing was. And one of the people who did so much to change that was, of course, Jackie Stewart, who started an enormous campaign, mainly because he thought the circuits were so dangerous, which they were. Getting the cars safer took a bit longer.
Yeah, it's dreadful going back into those days where it was on average a driver would be killed every single year, Simon. You know, up until around about 1982 when we lost Gilles Villeneuve during practice for the Belgian Grand Prix in Solder and Riccardo Paletti in Canada. It's awful. But when you think of those infamous weekends, you think of Imola 1994. I spoke to your good friend Bob Constantinos about this, and I emphasized that I couldn't imagine how awful of a weekend that must have felt for anyone that is involved within the sport, whether it be a driver, whether it be a team mechanic, whether it be a journalist or a commentator. But I don't know where you were at the time, but what that must have felt to you.
You mean Senna's accident?
Yeah, both Ernst and Roland Ratzenberger.
Yeah. Well, I could talk for a long time about that weekend. Of course, I was at Imola. In fact, there were 3 incidents, if you remember, because Rubens Barrichello had a horrible accident on Friday and was very lucky to get away with his life. Then there was Ratzenberger on Saturday, and of course there was Ayrton on Sunday. And I can't remember why, but I wasn't at Imola on Friday. And when I got to Imola on Saturday morning, first I'd heard obviously about Rubens' accident. And when I got there, walked into the paddock on Saturday morning, the first person I bumped into was Rubens, who his face was dreadfully bruised. He was walking very stiffly. And I said, "My God, Rubens, I heard about your accident. Are you all right?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay." So that was a fairly shocking accident. Because it wasn't hurt, it's kind of forgotten about. Then, of course, there was Ratzenberger on Saturday, which was very shocking. Roland was a lovely bloke. He wasn't going to be world champion. He wasn't in a particularly good car, and therefore, it sounds dreadful to say, but it didn't make headlines round the world on Sunday morning that an Austrian driver called Roland Ratzenberger had been killed. It was in the papers on Sunday morning, but it wasn't something that shattered the world. However, it did shatter Ayrton. Ayrton by then regarded himself. I mean, I'm not being unfair to him or saying anything that isn't generally known. Ayrton was arrogant. He really believed that he had a God-given right to be the best. And because of that, he also felt that he had a responsibility to be the most important driver in Formula One, and therefore the person most likely to be able to make a difference. And he was horrified by Ratzenberger's death. And a very good friend of mine, sadly no longer with us, but a wonderful man called Professor Sid Watkins, who was the Formula One doctor. All the drivers knew him. He would spend the race strapped into the medical car, safety car, which had a lot of medical equipment in it. He was a brilliant neurosurgeon, but he loved motor racing, and he spent his weekends as the FIA's chief medical officer. And he would spend the whole race strapped into the passenger seat of a fast car. It was usually something like a 6.9 Mercedes saloon, something like that, with a competent driver, maybe an ex-Formula One driver, in the driving seat with the engine running, and they would spend the whole race like that. So that if there was an accident, they could get there more quickly than any ambulance could. And all the drivers knew Sid. They all loved him. He was a lovable man, wonderful character. And he was particularly close to Ayrton. And I remember talking to Prof. Watkins in his house up in Scotland. This was years after Ayrton was killed. And I asked him about that day. And he said, Ayrton came to see me on Sunday morning and wanted to talk about the fact that Ratzenberger had been killed because he was horrified by it. And he then said to Sid, I don't really think I want to do this anymore. I think it no longer feels right for me, being a Formula One driver. This was Ayrton Senna, the best driver in the world. He obviously said this to Prof. Said obviously it was a very private conversation, but Sid felt quite relaxed about telling me all those years later. And he said, I don't think I want to go on doing this. And Sid said, for God's sake, Ayrton, if that's how you feel, you must stop. Don't do the race this afternoon. You've got to stop. You mustn't go racing if you're no longer feeling comfortable. Give it all up. Come up and stay with me in Scotland. We'll go fishing. And Ayrton said, I'd love to do that, but of course I can't. You know, contracts, the world championship. Of course I can't do that. And of course he did the race that afternoon, and we all know what happened. Now, I was commentating for BBC Radio on that race. And Murray was in the next cubicle. Very strange at Imola, because the broadcasting cubicles, you can't see the track. It's like being in a kind of Portaloo. You have your television screen. I'm sure it's very different now, but this was back then. You had your television screen, quite a small one. You had a timing screen, which gave you all the lap times and the positions and so on. That was all you had. And you couldn't see the track, so you were just focused on the screen. For me, doing the radio, I had to describe everything that was happening. Murray, obviously, was talking to the pictures. And when the accident happened, we all knew it was very serious because everything went quiet, everything was stopped. Sid was there. He was the first person on the scene in the medical car, and he was kneeling down by the cockpit. And we all knew it was pretty bad. Now, what BBC television did, because there was obviously a huge delay and nothing much was happening. When these things went out live in those days, rather than there being a sort of wall-to-wall television program, which was the Grand Prix, there were other sports going on. And if necessary, if there was a delay of the Grand Prix or whatever, they could go to the cricket or go to the athletics. And BBC Radio was just the same. They would have a program called Sunday Sport, which would dip in and out of all the different sports. And when the accident happened, quite quickly, the television producer in London realised that there was going to be a long delay. So he said in Murray's ear, "Okay, hand back to studio." So Murray said something like, "We're all waiting to hear what's happened with this accident. We wish Ayrton Senna well, and as soon as we got more news, we'll have it for you," and handed back to the studio. I could hear my producer in my ear, and I was longing to be able to hand back to the studio because there was nothing happening. We were all oppressed by this knowledge that almost certainly Ayrton Senna had died. But because the radio producer realised it was a huge story, he stayed with me, and I had to keep talking. And I could only obviously say what the situation was officially with Ayrton, and I had to talk about his career. I talked about the rest of what was going on this season. I don't know what I talked about, but it was a very difficult thing to do before finally radio did switch back. And then they came back to us, obviously, when the race did finally restart. The legal situation in Italy is such that if somebody dies at the scene of an event, then everyone involved, particularly the people who are promoting and running the event, clerk of the course, the organising club, all those people, are immediately implicated in this death. And for that reason, the organisers were very anxious that Ayrton's death should not be reported at the track. There's no doubt that he was dead at the track. I mean, the injury which he got from the front suspension rod, he was killed instantly. Well, what they did was they got his body into the helicopter. They flew the helicopter off to hospital, and then the message came out that he died in the helicopter. But it was extraordinary, and so great was the impact of Ayrton's death that kind of it affected everything. When we finally got to the airport, very late, because obviously the race had run very late, when we got to the airport, we found that everything was out of kilter. And I finally got back. I live 20 minutes from Heathrow. And when I finally landed, I think it was about 2:30 in the morning, and I got a cab and took me back to this house here. And as I drew up in the taxi, this television crew, actually from ITV News, materialised. They'd been camping in my front garden because they were so desperate to talk to anybody that they could find who'd been there. It was the most huge story. And it was dreadfully, dreadfully sad because Ayrton was, of course, a quite extraordinary man. I mean, his focus, his feeling of self, there was a sort of religiosity about how Ayrton set about his business. The first time I interviewed him, he just got the drive after his first season with Tolman. He just got his drive for Lotus. And I went up to Hethel, to the Lotus headquarters, and I interviewed him there. And he didn't know me then. I mean, I never really knew him at all. He wasn't an easy man to get to know. He wasn't particularly friendly with the journalists because he didn't need to be. He was just focused on what he had to do to be world champion. But we spent probably an hour talking about his career and how he'd got to this point and what he wanted to achieve. And Ayrton was not a bundle of laughs. Ayrton was always very serious. I mean, there were moments of humour, but they weren't directed towards anybody outside his immediate circle. You probably know the story about him and Gerhard Berger.
Away from Formula One, International Formula 3000, Simon. Now, for those who are wondering what is International Formula 3000, it's essentially it was Formula One's feeder series before becoming the GP2 series and now FIA Formula 2. But how was that experience, Simon, compared to what you had been used to within Formula One?
I loved Formula 3000. The cars were quite close to what Formula One cars were like then. So they were like slightly more compact Formula One cars with 3-litre engines, which were a standard engine, if you like. So they were a very even playing field. And they made, because they were quick, they had lots of horsepower. At a time when probably Formula One cars had 650 horsepower, these had 450. So they were a good run on the ladder close to Formula One. And it was a very successful Formula. One of the most intriguing races that was part of the Formula 3000 Championship was actually the Birmingham Grand Prix, which was a round the houses race in the middle of Birmingham. Extraordinary to think that it ever was able to take place at all, but it did. I think it probably lost somebody, I guess the Birmingham Council, a lot of money, but it was a very brave effort. And the circuit round the streets of Birmingham was surprisingly good. So I certainly enjoyed Formula 3000, and there were nice people doing it. I seem to remember that one of the battles that went on was between Nelson Piquet Jr. and Nico Rosberg. And it's interesting that Nico Rosberg became a successful Formula One driver and won the World Championship, whereas Nelson Piquet Jr. didn't. I know he sort of got into Formula One and was involved in that unfortunate cheating saga, which wasn't his fault. But one of the things I remember, which just shows perhaps how to be a Formula One parent, is I remember going to a test session, and it was the beginning of the season, Formula 3000 test session, and both Nelson Piquet Jr. and Nico Rosberg were there with their fathers. And during the day, while the session was going on, Nelson Piquet Sr. was constantly fretting around Nelson Jr., wouldn't leave him alone, kept giving him bits of advice, kept telling him what he was doing wrong, and generally interfering. And I mean, Nelson was an ex-world champion himself, and obviously a hugely experienced man, but he was, my impression was anyway, that he was kind of putting pressure on his son. Keke Rosberg, also an ex-world champion, by contrast, left Nico to it with his team and went and sat at the back of the grandstands and just watched the session. And I thought that was very interesting because, of course, it was Nico who became successful and Nelson Jr. who didn't. Keke, just one name because we happen to be talking about him. I mean, I must have known scores of Formula One drivers in my time. Keke was one I remember with particular affection because he was always very unassuming, very good-humoured, and he gave the impression of being somebody who hadn't been consumed by Formula One. He was, of course, hugely competitive, but he was entertaining and laid back out in the cockpit, which certainly during the season a lot of drivers find it difficult to do. So he was one of the good guys. I was very pleased when he won the World Championship. But yes, so Formula 3000 was a very competitive and very successful formula. One of the classes of racing which I have always loved and remember down the years with greatest affection is sports car racing. I mean, World Championship endurance racing, if you like. The Le Mans 24 Hours is a magic race which, although one can argue, if you're of my generation, that Formula One has changed out of all recognition and has lost a lot of its magic. Le Mans, somehow, even though the cars have progressed in their way, just as Formula One cars have progressed, and a modern Le Mans car like the Ferrari that has been so successful recently at Le Mans, they are hugely impressive technological marvels in just the same way that Formula One cars are. But somehow, maybe because Le Mans doesn't get the same glare of international attention, still very important among enthusiasts, but it does not get the huge following among ordinary man in the street type audience. So somehow Le Mans has preserved a lot of its magic. And if you've never been to Le Mans, you haven't lived as a motor racing enthusiast. You absolutely have to go to Le Mans at least once in your life. I went to Le Mans every year from 1967 to 2003, I suppose. However many years that is, 35 years or something. Nowadays, with modern communications and so on, if you're an Englishman, or an English person, at Le Mans, at the track, or whether you're at home, you can follow the race very well because there's the most wonderful institution called Radio Le Mans, which is available anywhere. And if you're actually at the track, you'll see people wearing headphones and listening to Radio Le Mans because it's a wonderful way of finding out what's happening in the race. And a small band of Le Mans mad commentators do a wonderful job all the way through the 24 hours of keeping what everybody praised as to what was going on. Before Radio Le Mans existed, about the only way in the English language you could find out what was going on was by listening to the BBC Radio. And the thing about Le Mans is it's no use having a big program about it and then 4, 6 or 8 hours later having another big program about it. You've got to follow the race. And I managed to persuade BBC Radio that the way they should cover Le Mans was by giving me 1 minute every hour. So I would do perhaps 10 minutes when the race started, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I would do 10 minutes at the end to cover the climax and finish of the race. But from 5 p.m. all the way through till 3 p.m. the next afternoon, I would do 60 seconds. They would put me out immediately after the news summary that happened at the top of the hour. So 2 a.m. news summary, and then over to Le Mans, and I would have my 1 minute. And that was a wonderful commentating task because 60 cars doing the race, you had to keep painting the picture, but you only had 59 seconds in which to do it. And you had to follow what was going on. I used to find that I would do my 1 minute broadcast. In those days, it was the broadcasting desks were on the 7th floor of the old concrete building, all gone now, on the outside of the track. And I would do my 1 minute. I would then run down 7 flights of stairs, go through the pedestrian tunnel under the track, and walk down the pit lane, speaking to people, seeing what problems were going on, trying to get a picture of what was going on. And I would do that until about 22 the next hour. I'd then run back down the pits through the pedestrian tunnel, up 7 flights of stairs, and just have time to scribble out my 59 seconds and then do the next one. And I would do that from the start of the race to the finish of the race. And my dear wife would come to Le Mans with me and keep me going on black coffee and the odd tot of brandy. And it was fabulous. It was my favourite weekend of the year. And Le Mans still has an enormous amount of magic. It has, incidentally, the largest British audience of any overseas motor racing event by far. I think about 45 or 50,000 Brits go. And there's a wonderful camaraderie as you leave Calais and you come down the roads, the various campers and people on mopeds with GB plates and everybody making this pilgrimage to Le Mans and then going back again on the Monday. It's a fabulous event. And if you haven't been, you should go.
I would love to go to Le Mans. I mean, it's such a wonderful event. I'm not as knowledgeable with the World Endurance Championship like I am with other motorsports, but if there's one race that I would absolutely love to go to that's nothing to do with single seaters, it's the 24 hours of Le Mans. It's like it's almost like a party atmosphere when you're there, because it's almost like you see the Ferris wheel there, you see all the rides, you see all the cars on showcase, everything.
The other sports car races, of course, still happen, but again, I'm sounding like an old man telling you how things were in the old days. But what was really magical about endurance sports car racing in days gone by were the other races. I mean, obviously, you'll know about the Mille Miglia, which was 1,000 miles around Italy. Well, that stopped in 1957 because there were so many accidents. Because there was no crowd protection. 1,000 miles around Italy with cars running on public roads. And these were cars competing for the World Championship of sports cars. So they were the latest and quickest Ferraris and Jaguars and Aston Martins and so on. And the crowds would stand right by the edge of the track. And if a car went off, spectators would get killed. And you can't have that. And that race stopped in 1957. But there was another wonderful road race, the Targa Florio, which went round Sicily. And that equally was going through villages and up and down mountains and so on. And that carried on into the 1970s. And that was an amazing race. And again, because it was a round of the championship, all the works teams from Porsche, from Ferrari, from Aston Martin, from Jaguar, whoever they all, and particularly AC Cobra, when they started in the 60s, they would all go and do the Targa Florio, an incredible race, which would go on for about 7 hours around these lanes in Sicily. Coming closer to home, Britain had its own round of the World Sports Car Championship, which was the BOAC 1000. It was originally the BOAC 500. It was a 6-hour race because if you wanted to have a round of the World Sports Car Championship, your race had to be a minimum of 6 hours or 1,000 kilometers. And Sebring was 12 hours. Daytona was and still is 24 hours. But the race at Brands Hatch was 6 hours, as I remember it. Or no, I think it was 1,000 kilometers, and it would last about 6.5, 7 hours. And in my memory, it usually rained. And seeing round Brands Hatch was narrower then than it is now, and the earth banks were a lot closer to the track. And seeing the Porsche 917s, those were the great big 4.5 litre, wicked 240 mile an hour Porsches, and the equivalent 512S Ferraris with Formula One drivers, because all the Formula One drivers used to do the World Sports Car Championship. So you had Chris Amon and Jack Ickx in Ferraris, you had Pedro Rodriguez and Joe Siffert in the Porsches, and you would also have, as you always do have in endurance racing, classes for smaller cars. So traffic is always a problem. It's rather like at Le Mans, where you may be doing, if you're in one of the quickest cars, you'll be doing 240 miles an hour down the Mont-Saint Straight. And until whichever year it was, they now have 2 chicanes in the Mont-Saint Straight. The cars are still getting to those sorts of speeds. But in days gone by, it was 3.5 miles, flat out. And you'd be doing 240 miles an hour. And you would be closing on maybe one of the, a Group 4 car, maybe catching a Group 6 car, which was perhaps doing only 220 miles an hour. So you had a 20 mile an hour speed difference. But that car doing 220 was passing another car which could only do 190. And then as you went over the brow of the hill, there was one of the little cars which was only doing 170. So you can see what the traffic problem could be. If you think that could have been at 2 in the morning, or maybe at 5 in the morning when you tended to get early morning mist, the hazards were pretty extreme. But seeing those big cars at Brands Hatch, they used to get very big crowds who would stand under umbrellas for 7 hours watching Pedro Rodriguez and Joe Siffert in those big Porsches. Magic stuff. And sports car racing still does exist, and it still happens at great circuits like Spa and the Nürburgring, and long may it continue.
In relation to you, Simon, what have you got lined up involving you? Is there like a new book or like a new podcast or something? What have you got lined up ahead, maybe in the next year or two?
The main thing I have lined up, I said right at the beginning of our chat that you could do motor racing at all sorts of levels. You could get, a Toyota hatchback for £1,000 and you could do hill climbing or sprinting or whatever. I, at my great age, am still a competitor. I do hill climbing in a car that is unique. It is the only one in the world quite like this, and it's a very potent, hairy motor car, which has far more power than I know how to deal with. And I go to hill climbs like Shelsley Walsh, Prescott, Kirsten Down, all these great British hill climbs. A lot of your listeners may never have been to a British hill climb. It's a wonderful day's sport. A lot of people think that a hill climb involves driving up a muddy hill and seeing whether you can get to the top. That is not hill climbing. That's something else called trials. Hill climbing involves racing a car up a narrow, twisting, steep piece of tarmac as fast as you possibly can. And to put it into context, people who are doing the British Hill Climb Championship have extremely modern, highly sophisticated single-seaters, which look probably like Formula One cars looked about 7 years ago. So they're extremely sophisticated, ground effects, full aero. They may have Formula One engines of the past. They may have a Cosworth DFV. Quite a lot of them are now using IndyCar engines, which were 2.8 litres turbocharged. Some of them use them without the turbocharger because it suits the courses better. And to give you an idea, Shelsley Walsh is 1,000 yards, twisty, steep. The road is 11 feet wide at the top. It's a straight at the top. It's 11 feet wide. I've measured it. The championship people are doing 175 miles an hour over the finish line. Now, if you imagine in a car that with big slicks, it's probably 6.5 feet wide, and you're doing 175 miles an hour on a piece of road that's 11 feet wide, that demands quite a lot of skill. The car I hill climb is not like that. It's a historic hill climb car. It was raced as a Formula 2 car by Stirling Moss in 1950. Then went to America, was fitted with a 400 horsepower Chevrolet V8. And it runs as a historic sports car. And I prefer, because it is road legal, I prefer to drive all sorts of weathers to the events because that's part of the fun. So you ask, what am I up to? Well, hill climbs really do take up quite a lot of my time. I'm still writing a monthly column for Classic and Sports Car magazine, which is, I think, a great magazine. I'm biased because I launched it for Haymarket 45 years ago, I suppose. I still write odd features. Just done a feature for an American auction company about a historic car that they were selling. I still talk to people who want to listen to me. I do interviews, book launches, that sort of thing. Derek Warwick has recently written an excellent autobiography, and I helped Derek promote that to an audience at Silverstone, an audience at Brooklands. I do stuff like that. I have to say, I don't think I work terribly hard. I'm now 80 years old, and I work enough to sort of stop myself getting bored, really. And aren't I lucky? But I can still do what I love to do. I just don't do it quite as hard as I used to.
From your experience then, what advice could you share on those wanting to work within, for instance, motorsport journalism, or in fact within the motorsport community? What advice could you give to them, Simon?
It's very difficult because there isn't an automatic answer to that. The only thing I would say is make friends. Surprisingly, people are friendly in motorsport media. They're friendly in certainly the lower rungs of motorsport. If you want to become a motorsport journalist, you should go to as many events as you possibly can. You should write reports of any event you go to for your own interest, because it's a way of practicing. But what you should also do, it's no good submitting a 10,000 word report in your own idiosyncratic style to a publication which only wants a 500 word report. What you could do, have a look at a magazine you know well. It may be Autosport, or it may be a website that you know well, and you can understand the style and the length of the sort of reports they want, and then get onto them and say, I'm going to this event at the weekend, would you like something? And they'll say, well, no, because we've got our chap going to that. And you can say, well, I'd like to write a report anyway and send it to you. And then if you can possibly read it and give me some advice, I'd be very grateful. And if your stuff is good enough, in the end, somebody will say, oh, we can't use Fred this week because he's on holiday or he's got to go to a funeral. Who's this young lad that keeps sending us this stuff? Let's give him a try. You've got to just persistently put yourself about, go to events, and they don't have to be Formula One races, because getting into a Formula One race is very expensive or very difficult. But there's lots of motorsport that you can go to, and the more people you can talk to, the more people you can get to know, the better. And then occasionally vacancies arise. And how I got my job on Autosport was that a vacancy suddenly arose and they had to fill the gap, fill the slot. And they said, well, let's find one of these people who's been pestering us and put him in. It's quicker than actually interviewing lots of people we don't know. So put yourself around, go to lots of events, if you want to be a writer, if you want to be a journalist, write for yourself because it's good practice. Write not how you want to read it, but how you think the editor of a magazine would want to read it. So write in his style, write to his length. The other thing you need to do as a journalist is do it very quickly, particularly nowadays. In my day, it was all print, but still you needed to get the report in within hours. Now, of course, you need to get it in within minutes because websites are constantly updating. But with modern communications, you can do that. In the 1960s, if somebody wanted to write a report, we wanted somebody to write a report of a race meeting at Alton Park, they would go to Alton Park, they would watch the race, they would take a couple of rolls of film, they would write their 1,000-word report, they would go to a railway station, probably Liverpool railway station for Alton Park, by midnight, and put that report on a train, and we would collect it at 6 o'clock on Monday morning in London. Sounds incredibly primitive. But before they invented mobile phones and email and computers, that's how it was done. But if you're writing a report, you've got to be able to do it very quickly. You've got to be able to do it to the style of a medium, whether it's a website or a magazine. And you've got to practice doing it. And you need to know all the people. If you go to an event, I'm not talking about a Formula 1 race, go to a club race at Brands Hatch. Find out, if you're an Autosport reader, find out who the Autosport correspondent is who's covering that race. Ask him if you can give him a hand running around finding him information. Get to know all these people. And in the end, when a gap appears, you'll know about it before everybody else, and you may be lucky.
Simon, I've absolutely loved this chat today. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for providing some brilliant, brilliant advice to those who are wanting to get a career in motorsport. And we hope to have you on again very, very soon.
Well, thanks for asking me, and it's been fun. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much.